So a lot of people think that drones are nothing more than just flying cameras. And if you stuck with me this far, you know that's not true, because we've talked about LiDAR drones, and we've talked about multispectral drones, and we've talked about thermal drones, and we've talked about how, that camera, that RGB sensor, can be utilized to make accurate maps and point clouds and do volumetrics and measurements. You're listening to the Drone Advantage podcast. This is your first class ticket to aerial intelligence. Drones aren't just flying cameras, they're business tools that provide critical data for construction, agriculture, real estate, and infrastructure inspections. The key is understanding how each data type works and what sensors are involved, and how processing methods turn raw data into actionable intelligence. So how does drone imaging actually work anyway? The real-world applications that are driving business results are going to be discussed in the next 20 minutes or so. And what are some of the biggest misconceptions that are stopping companies from fully leveraging this technology? We're going to get into that too. I'm going to answer those questions and a bunch more. Let's take a deep dive into the most powerful types of drone imaging and their real-world applications. I'm Rob, a commercial airline pilot, FAA certified drone pilot, and the owner of the Tampa Bay franchise of Blue Nose Aerial Imaging. Welcome to the Drone Advantage podcast, where we break down how aerial intelligence is transforming industries and how you can use drone data to work smarter. I'm super excited about today's episode because we finally get to talk about what I spent the last episode telling you we were going to talk about. Today we'll go deep into how drone imaging works. We're going to talk about the science behind the data capture, with the most valuable real-world applications, what industries are using drone data, and we're also going to talk about some common misconceptions or some myths that keep businesses from fully adopting drones. And most importantly, we're going to talk about the ROI of drone imaging and how this technology really saves time, it reduces costs, and improves efficiencies, because that's what we're here for. By the end of this episode, you're going to have a clear understanding of how drones are changing industries, how businesses are using them to gain a competitive advantage, and why businesses that aren't using them are leaving money on the table. Let's get started. In this first segment, we're going to talk about how drone imaging actually works. At its core, drone imaging is really about capturing, processing, and analyzing aerial data. But not like aerial or traditional aerial photography, today's drones don't just take pictures, they collect actionable business intelligence. So let's break this process down. There's actually 4 steps to go from, hey, I need this data, to, hey, look, I have this data, right? So the first step really is the flight plan, right? So you hire a professional drone operator, and that professional drone operator then needs to plan the flight. So he or she is going to use some software, and they're going to map the area if it's a mapping project, for example, and that's going to ensure an automated flight that where the drone is capturing images at the correct overlap and altitude. So the next step is to go out to the field. So that first step is oftentimes is actually done before you ever go out to the field. It's in the office. The next step 2, we actually go out to the field and we fly the drone. And what are we flying though? We're not just flying this aircraft. This aircraft has some sort of payload mounted on it. So these sensors really just allow us to capture the data that we need, that we are then going to process in step 3. Step 3 is when we're going to go back to the office, we're going to open up our computer and open up our photogrammetry software, and we're going to upload the data that the drone captured into this photogrammetry software that is then going to either make whatever the deliverable is that's desired. It could either make a 2-dimensional, high resolution orthomosaic map. It can make 3D models, point clouds, digital elevation models, multispectral analysis, thermal analysis. It could be a LiDAR processor. But whatever the desired deliverable is, it's going to take the raw images or raw data, and it's going to turn it into actionable intelligence that you can then use to make informed business decisions. And step 4 is just that. It's taken the deliverable, it's turning it into a report, it's turning it into an actual intelligence that you can use in your business to save money. So we've talked about the 4 steps to get from I need this data to I have this data. What I want to do is I want to do kind of a deep dive into the types of sensors that are on these drones. So the first sensor we're going to talk about is an RGB camera. So this RGB just stands for red, green, blue. It's talking about the visible spectrum of light that's somewhere between 400 and 700 nanometers in wavelength. This is what most people think about when they think of a drone camera. So the camera that's on your cell phone is RGB. The DSLR cameras, if you have one of those, that is also RGB, or it normally would be an RGB camera. So this is just taking the visible spectrum of light. It runs, the light goes through a lens, a shutter opens up, and that light has a sensor. And there's 2 common types of sensors that are in these cameras. The most common type is called a CMOS sensor, and that stands for complementary metal oxide semiconductor, if anybody wants to geek out on that. The second most common sensor is called a CCD sensor, or a charge coupled device sensor. I'm not going to get into the mechanics of what one sensor is and what the other sensor isn't, and which ones are better when. This is just very high level, a 30,000 foot view, or in our case, a 400 foot view, just of the sensors in an RGB camera. So the CMOS sensor, CMOS, is the most common type of sensor that is used in drones. Now on drones, what makes these cameras different than just your cell phone camera or a DSLR camera is that the camera is generally, at least on enterprise level drones, is generally mounted on a very, very accurate and precise gimbal. So when the aircraft, when the drone is up in the sky and the wind is hitting it and it's shaking back and forth, these drones have incredible image stabilization. So you won't see that in a video, for example. Or when the drone accelerates or decelerates, it pitches down to accelerate and it pitches up to decelerate. The gimbal follows the drone's movements to keep the camera stable. And in these videos, it's incredible because you just actually can't see the drone movements in the video. So RGB images can be used to process orthomosaic maps and 3D models and point clouds. And when they're combined with the GPS metadata and the RTK corrections onto that metadata, these maps become very, very accurate. So we take these RGB images or photos and we run them through photogrammetry software. And what photogrammetry software does is it runs a process that's called orthorectification, if you really want to geek out on big words here. Orthorectification just means that the software is removing any distortions or any oblique angles. So think about if you're in a building, in a high-rise building, you're looking out the window. And you're looking down at all the things that you can see. And when you look to the left, you can see the right side of all of the objects to your left. And then when you look to the right, you can see the left side of all of the objects on your right. The objects that are in front of you, you see the side that's facing you. So these are oblique angles. Orthorectification removes all of that. So it takes all of these images and stitches them together. And what you get is a map to where no matter where you're looking on the map, it is in a perspective as if you were looking straight down at that point. So there's no, like I said, oblique angles. And then the drone's going to go out and fly this oftentimes in a completely automated fashion where we're going to hit takeoff and the drone's going to fly and it's going to come back and land. That isn't always the case. Sometimes we have to do manual capture for some of these missions, or maybe a portion of a mission will be manually captured, or all of a mission will be manually captured. In short, if you need detailed mapping with precise measurements, orthomosaic imagery is a game changer compared to standard aerial photography. Okay, now let's dive into multispectral imaging. Multispectral imaging detects light that's beyond our visible spectrum. Well, it also detects light that is within the visible spectrum as well. So a multispectral camera generally will detect near infrared, red edge, also the red, the green, and the blue. And you might ask, well, why does it need to detect the red, the green, and the blue? Because I already have an RGB camera. And that is true. But the sensor in your RGB camera is collecting the red, the green, and the blue all together. The multispectral camera will actually isolate. You'll have one camera that just picks up the green, and one camera that just picks up the red, and then one camera that just picks up the near infrared, and one that just picks up the red edge. You might have one in there that picks up the blue as well. A lot of times the blue is the least useful wavelength, and some of the most popular multispectral imagers on drones have actually left out the blue camera and traded that real estate for bigger sensors to have more megapixels per sensor, a higher resolution. So with all that being said, what do we do with all of these photos? Because they're all photos. When a multispectral camera takes a photo, every imager takes its own separate photo. So if we just, for example, in a DJI Mavic 3 multispectral drone, which is the one that I have, you have an RGB camera. You also have 4 multispectral cameras. You have a green, a red edge, and a near infrared. And so every time the drone takes a photo, it's actually taking 5 photos. It takes the RGB photo so that we can put together that orthomosaic map. It takes a green photo, a red photo, a red edge photo, and a near infrared photo. And when you look at these photos, because this is light and wavelengths that we can't see, the photos are all gray to us. So if we just look at these photos, they don't do us any good, because then they all look almost the same. They're just like different shades of gray. So what do we do with these photos that we can't even see the color of? Well, we're going to upload them into a multispectral processing software. That software is going to put all of this data together, and it's going to come up with these colorized maps. And these colorized maps are called indices. And so the most common indice, and if you're in agriculture at all, you have heard of the NDVI indice. NDVI stands for Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. And you have been able to use this to detect some crop health. Another real popular indice is NDRE, which is Normalized Difference Red Edge. And NDRE is really more useful for looking at mature crops that might oversaturate the red reflection. So how does this multispectral software, analyze this data and come up with vegetation indices or the health of a plant? Well, plants absorb certain wavelengths of light and reflect certain wavelengths of light. And the wavelengths of light that they reflect at different rates. So one wavelength will be reflected at a higher rate than another wavelength. Okay, next up is thermal imaging. What is thermal imaging? So without going into the science of thermal cameras, by the way, if you want to go into the science of thermal cameras, drop it in the comments below. Tell me that you want an episode about thermal cameras and thermal imaging, and we'll do one. So who's using thermal imaging anyway? I mean, how is it beneficial to be able to see temperature differences in things? So think about, solar farms. If you guys have ever been driving down the interstate and you look and you see, just acres and acres and acres of solar panels. Well, these solar farms are often using thermal imaging to scan their entire farm, and through temperature differences, they can detect faulty panels and identify hotspots and where energy isn't being converted properly. Or we can just do a solar panel inspection on a roof. So it doesn't have to be a big solar panel farm. It can just be solar panels on your roof to make sure that the panels are functioning correctly. But even speaking of roofs, we can just do roof inspections, even if there's no solar panels. Roof inspections, HVAC inspections, the entire building. We can identify, leaks and insulation failures and overheating electrical components. In search and rescue operations, they can locate people that are missing at night by being able to scan very large areas very quickly with thermal imaging. And then, of course, firefighting. Firefighters can see through smoke with thermal imagers. Firefighters that have just put out a structure fire, for example, so they use thermal imaging to detect hot spots to make sure they don't have to come back later to another structure fire. So really, thermal imaging is all about finding those hidden problems before they become disasters. Okay, now we're going to dive into LiDAR. So what is LiDAR? LiDAR stands for Light Detection and Ranging. So this is really using laser beams, basically. So in its most generic form, what's happening is an emitter emits a laser pulse, and it times how long it takes that laser to come back. And from that, it knows exactly how far away from whatever object it hit the sensor is. So by emitting thousands of these pulses and timing how long each pulse takes to come back, LiDAR is very, very efficient and very accurate at mapping terrain and doing elevation modeling. So 3D terrain mapping and digital elevation models. And LiDAR really is the gold standard at doing just that. And there's also applications where an RGB camera trying to do a digital elevation model just isn't effective. So RGB, again, is just a camera, right? And it's using reflected light. So if you can't see through something, then the RGB camera cannot see it. So think about any place that has dense vegetation, for example, forest, or think of a rainforest. If you try to map the ground that is densely covered with vegetation or trees with RGB, you can't see the ground because it's not visible. LiDAR is very, very effective at penetrating through that vegetation and actually getting to the ground. So any application where a 3D model or a digital elevation model is needed and you can't actually see the ground from the air, LiDAR is where it's at. So again, I'm not going to go into the science of the imagers, but if you want an episode on LiDAR, put it in the comments below and I'll get you an episode on LiDAR. Now that we've talked about the different payloads that drones can carry, let's now talk about some real-world applications and how drone imaging is used to save money and reduce costs and improve efficiency, because that's really what this is all about. So I'm just going to kind of go through these one industry at a time, and I'm going to start with the construction industry. And one of the ways that drones save money in construction is simply by reducing delays and reducing cost overruns. 70% of construction projects run over budget, and a significant amount of them also run behind schedule. So one of the ways that drone imaging can be used to keep a construction project on schedule would be simply looking at cut fill reports, for example, during earthworks. If we were to look at cut and fill reports on week 1, week 2, week 3, and we know approximately how much dirt has to be moved, so we can budget that schedule and say X number of cubic feet per week to keep this project on track. And then we're 2 weeks in and we see that we have only moved 1 week worth of dirt or 1.5 weeks worth of dirt. We can catch that very quickly before continuing on that pace and ending up significantly behind schedule without even knowing it was happening. Now we can see that, oh, we're 4 days behind schedule, and now our new pace needs to be Y number of cubic feet in order to catch back up. So that's one way that using weekly or sometimes even daily drone monitoring can really point out if we're falling behind schedule very early so that we don't have to play a lot of catch up. Another way that drones are helping in construction is just reducing the manual survey inefficiencies. Just how long does it take to go out and survey a piece of property? So drones, and I want to be clear, are not replacing surveyors, right? Because surveyors, if you need sub-centimeter accuracy, and that accuracy is going to be very, very important for a particular application, you're going to have a licensed surveyor come out and survey your property or survey your site. But oftentimes, and I would I would submit that even most of the time, centimeter level accuracy is just good enough for most of the things that we do. And we don't actually have to have a survey stamp on something that you may be having surveyed right now only because you need something within a centimeter of accuracy. Well, the drone can get you that. So oftentimes, if you don't actually need a site officially surveyed, but you just need that accuracy, that's where drones can come in, and that 2D orthomosaic mapping can be very beneficial for you and really save you a lot of money in the surveying fees, but not just the money, but also the time. I just mapped a property. It took, I think it was 26 minutes of flight time to map like 35 acres. And then, of course, there's some software processing time, but I can turn, a job like that, I can turn around in like 24 to 48 hours. And have everything you need, volumetrics and measurements or whatever you need out of that project. Another way that we're saving money in the construction or the infrastructure inspection industry is really just increasing the safety. So we're reducing the number of times that people have to go out and climb stockpiles, or reducing the number of times that people have to go out and climb cell phone towers, or whatever the case may be. Now, again, drones don't replace tower climbers, right? They just reduce the number of times those towers have to be climbed. So, for example, instead of climbing up a tower to find out what's wrong and then coming back down and getting the things you need to fix whatever was wrong and then climbing back up again, if we did a if we did a digital twin of that tower, and then you can inspect that tower from the desktop, from your desktop in your office, and then you could, find everything that's wrong with that tower that needs repaired, and then send a crew up just one time to repair the tower instead of 2 times to inspect and repair the tower. You have saved man hours, you've saved time, you've increased efficiency, and you've saved cost. Because the time that it takes the drone to create that digital twin is going to be much less expensive than the labor of the tower climbers to go up and do the inspection manually. So just to recap, the 3 key problems that I just introduced in the construction industry are really cost overruns and delays, manual surveying inefficiencies, and safety risks. So now let's move on to agriculture and precision farming. So here our goal is to maximize yields while reducing costs. And I told you in the last episode that through aerial imaging, we can do that simultaneously. We can reduce costs and maximize yields at the same time, which is just a win-win on both ends. So some of the big problems in agriculture, first, just losing crops due to not knowing that they were unhealthy. Farmers lose 20 to 30% of their yields to disease and pests and irrigation issues. And speaking of irrigation issues, another problem is really just overuse of water and fertilizer and pesticides, and that leads to waste and increased environmental pressure. And then, of course, just lack of real-time insights, just not knowing exactly what's going on right now out in the fields. And that really makes it hard to make decisions or accurate decisions, and it makes it impossible to make database decisions. So how do we solve those problems? So back when we talked about the NDVI and the NDRE, the crop health analysis indices, the main function of those images or that data is to really just spot problems before they become costly. So the NDVI detects, real early stage plant stress. And when the plants are young, you're definitely going to be able to see plant stress before you'd be able to see that stress with the naked eye. And the NDRE, like I said before, is really better at detecting stress earlier in more mature plants and high biomass vegetation like orchards and vineyards. And in doing this, we really can pinpoint the problem areas. We can find out where we're watering too much or not watering enough. We can find out where there's insect stress or there's a lack of fertilization. And we can go and we can target those areas with the proper fixes, whether it be less water or less fertilizer or more fertilizer or herbicide or pesticide. And studies show that if we do all this correctly and we do this consistently, we can increase our yields by up to 10% and decrease pesticide and fertilizer use by 20 to 30%. So that goes right back to what I was saying with reducing costs and increasing yields simultaneously. And how do we reduce pesticide and fertilizer use? Well, we do that with precision fertilization. One of the multispectral imaging softwares that I use can actually write a prescription for the field. Say, we need less fertilizer here and more fertilizer there. Take that file and put it into the planning software in a John Deere tractor, for example, and the John Deere tractor can then just run that profile. The driver can just sit back and monitor the tractor as it drives, and in the exact GPS positions that it knows that it has to increase the rate of fertilization or decrease the rate of fertilization. All of that becomes automated. So when we automate things, we take the human error out of it and the human variability out of it, and ultimately we end up saving money by using less product. Okay, let's move on to real estate. So real estate, when we think about drone imaging, real estate is probably the very first thing we think of because it's the thing that gets the most touch points with the public. But why are the most successful realtors actually using aerial imaging, photography, and videography? Well, at the end of the day, we sell properties faster and for more money. Really increasing the wow factor of a property through aerial imaging just increases the excitement that buyers feel when they look at that property. And another thing too is not just showcasing the property, but aerial imaging also showcases the surrounding area. If the property happens to be in a really good area, it's away from highways or there's schools right down the road or whatever you're trying to showcase, we can showcase that through aerial imaging. So some of the key business problems that realtors are facing really is just, listings taking too long to sell, and, or how about it's really difficult to showcase really big properties. So think of a ranch that has, 40 or 60 acres. Well, how are we going to show all of that by walking around taking photos with our DSLR camera? Well, it's going to be very difficult, but put a drone in the air and very quickly we can showcase the entire property in a short video and really get buyers excited about the property. And really, I guess the third problem is that buyers really want an immersive experience. So one of the ways that drones have been used in real estate marketing are these, first person view, fly through the home videos are very, very popular, and they're selling houses very quickly. It's kind of like taking the Matterport scans and really leveling them up instead of, if you're not familiar with Matterport scans, that's like, think about being on Google Maps, and then you go to the street view and it's got the circles, and you click on the circle and it moves you over to it, and then it's a 360, you can look around. Well, a Matterport scan in real estate is kind of the same thing, where you can walk through the house, and it's done with 360 cameras and whatnot. So that provides that immersive experience that we were talking about. But if you can take a small first person drone and fly it through the house, buyers really like that. And what's the ROI here? Well, the ROI is that statistically, properties sell for anywhere between 5 and 10% more if they've used drone imaging than if they didn't. And also, statistically, engagement on a listing is increased by 40% if there's aerial imaging involved, either, like I said, just photos and or video. And some ROI on those, indoor fly-throughs. Statistically, those indoor fly-throughs reduce in-person showings by 30 to 50%, which really reduces the amount of time that the realtor has to spend. So if a realtor has many, many listings, they don't have time to go to every single property every day. So using these indoor fly-throughs really reduces the number, like I said, 30 to 50%, reduces the number of in-person showings that they have to do. which traditionally you would think is a bad thing. You don't want to reduce the amount of showings because you would think that you're reducing touch points, but you're really not, because again, statistically, these fly-throughs increase buyer interest, and it actually reduces the number of days that a listing is on the market. Okay, guys, so for our next topic, I promised you we were going to talk about some common misconceptions of drone imaging. And, despite all the things that we just went through, and despite all of the ways that I just showed you that drones actually save companies money, it turns out that a lot of businesses are very hesitant to really get into drone imaging and start using it. And that hesitation generally comes from misconceptions. It generally comes up from, thinking that the drones are just an added expense when really they are, as we had talked about, a savings. So, of course, these myths and misconceptions are really preventing companies from saving money and improving their efficiency and staying competitive. So let's break down some of the biggest ones that I see. The first one, drones are just for taking videos and photos. Well, we know that's not true, as we've just spent the last, many minutes talking about. The reality is that drones don't just capture images. Drones generate actionable data. So a lot of people think that drones are nothing more than just flying cameras. And if you stuck with me this far, you know that's not true, because we've talked about LiDAR drones, and we've talked about multispectral drones, and we've talked about thermal drones, and we've talked about how, that camera, that RGB sensor, can be utilized to make accurate maps and point clouds and do volumetrics and measurements. What's the second misconception? The second misconception is drones aren't accurate enough for surveying and measurements. Well, we know that's not true, because now we know that drones that are utilizing advanced technology like RTK or PPK can achieve accuracy that's within 1 to 3 centimeters, which is comparable to traditional survey methods. A lot of people assume that drones are just estimates, but that's really just outdated thinking. I mean, the combination of the RTK and PPK, corrected GPS geotagging with LiDAR or other, photogrammetry, combined with ground control points, make drone data very, very accurate for, construction grading or earthworks, those cut and fill reports, stockpile volume calculations, utility corridor mapping, floodplain and watershed analysis is another one. I don't know if I've mentioned that one, but really companies using drone surveying can reduce their fieldwork costs by over 50%, sometimes up to 80%, while still getting survey-grade accuracy. Misconception number 3, drone services are too expensive. Well, the reality is that using drone services can be 5 or maybe even up to 10 times less expensive than the methods you're already using. So if you think that bringing in a drone operator is just going to be expensive, consider this. If you hire a surveyor, a typical survey can cost $3,000 to $5,000? A drone survey, less than $1,000. If you need to do a helicopter-based inspection, that's going to be over $10,000 to do that. Drone inspection of the same area? I don't know, probably $2,000. And farmers that are using drones to detect crop stress so that they can optimize their spraying cut their pesticide costs by 20 to 30%. That far outweighs the cost of hiring a drone pilot. So while a lot of business owners and managers think that using drone technology is just high-tech luxury tools, in reality, they can save money with the first 1 to 2 drone flights. Okay, let's move on to misconception number 4. I need to own a drone to leverage aerial intelligence. That is just not true. The reality is that most businesses outsource their drone imaging. And the reasons are simple. It's because the equipment is expensive and it's not what they're specializing in. They have to train employees to fly or hire a full-time pilot. And then on top of that, they have to stay compliant with the FAA regulations. They have to keep the software up to date. They have to keep the firmware on the drones up to date. They have to maintain the drones. They have to, the employees will need recurrent training. So just as you would hire an accountant to do your taxes, you hire a drone pilot to take care of the specialized field of aerial intelligence capture. And the reasons are simple, because a quality drone operator is already going to have high-end drones. They're already going to have the photogrammetry software or the multispectral software or the thermal imaging software that they need to process this data. And they've already got the expertise on exactly how to plan these flights and fly the drones. They've already got their license from the FAA, their Part 107 license. And speaking of FAA licensing, dealing with the FAA can sometimes be a headache. Leave that to the drone operators because that's their full-time job. And unless you are a huge construction company that has their own, jets and, they can afford their own flight department, if you can afford your own flight department, you probably can afford your own drone department as well. But most construction companies aren't in that boat. Most construction companies are outsourcing their drone pilots. Okay, moving on to misconception number 5. Regulations make it too complicated to use drones. Well, the reality is that your drone service provider is going to navigate all of those regulations for you. That's not up to you. You hire the drone service provider, they deal with the FAA. It'll be up to your drone service provider to deal with things like airspace authorizations from the FAA if they're required, or taking on the liability risk of drone crashes because we've already got our specialized insurance for that, or privacy concerns if neighbors are around and they're complaining about their drones. And how does hiring a drone service provider save you money? Well, you avoid these big fines imposed by the FAA because you accidentally used your drone illegally. Here's a short story for you. Just recently, I just heard this on the news a week or two ago. Just recently, a guy was in Cape Canaveral and he flew his drone 3 times and he was just taking videos. I don't even know what he was taking videos of, but apparently he flew in a TFR, which is a temporary flight restriction. And this individual is from Canada, so he was down in Florida on vacation and he took his drone up 3 times. He did whatever he did with his drone, captured some videos, and then he went home to Canada. And a couple of weeks later, they knocked on his door and they arrested him, and he is now facing charges for 3 counts of operating a drone in a temporary flight restriction, and he's facing up to a year in prison per flight. Now, the jury's out, so to speak. He hasn't had his day in court, so we don't know, and everybody's innocent until proven guilty. But that just goes to show that it really is best to leave, things like airspace authorizations and operating the aircraft legally up to professional drone pilots. And our last misconception is that drones will replace traditional jobs. And that's not right. Drones don't replace traditional jobs. They don't replace any jobs. All drones do is they make skilled workers more efficient, and they reduce dangerous, hazardous labor. So if you're a surveyor that thinks that drones are going to eliminate your field crew, or if you're a construction worker that thinks that drones are going to replace site managers, or you're an inspector that thinks that drones are going to take away the need for boots on the ground, again, drones don't replace people. They just provide better data so that professionals can make faster and smarter decisions. So for example, surveyors are still going to analyze the drone data. It's just going to speed up the process of getting the data. Site managers are still going to be there to make the critical calls. Drones are just providing the real-time updates. And inspectors are still reviewing the inspection reports. Drones are just making it safer to get those visuals. So how does this affect the bottom line? Well, again, statistically, businesses that leverage drone imaging or drone technology increase their efficiency by 50 to 70%. And that's just giving the professionals more time to analyze the data instead of actually having to go out and capture the data. So what's the big takeaways of the misconceptions? Well, first, drones are business intelligence tools. They're not just cameras. Second, they're very accurate, they're very fast, and they're very cost effective. Third, hiring a drone service is way cheaper than traditional methods. 4, FAA regulations aren't a barrier as long as you're working with trained professionals. And 5, drones don't eliminate jobs. They just make the professionals more efficient. So what's the bottom line? If you still believe any of these myths, you're leaving money on the table, and your competitors have an edge because your competitors are using drones. Okay, guys, in the next episode, we're going to focus on the construction industry, really drill down on exactly how drones are eliminating all these costly mistakes that we're talking about. Do you have an episode topic that you want to hear about? Just leave it in the comments. If you ask me to do an episode in a particular area or focus on a particular area or answer a question, just leave it in the comments. I'll do an episode. I'll answer any questions that you have. I'll do a deep dive into any topics you guys want to talk about with drones. If you're listening on an audio app like Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please subscribe to the show. If you're listening on YouTube, please leave me a comment. Give me that thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel because we've got so much more coming. I'm going to leave links to the audio podcasts in the description below. I'm also going to leave a link to the podcast website down below in the description. So the podcast website is just thedroneadvantage.buzzsprout.com, and if you go there, everything that has to do with this podcast will be in one spot. You can get to any podcast hosting app, whether it be again Spotify or Apple. You can look at show notes, the transcripts. There's going to be a link at the top of every show that's going to say send us a text. You can text the show. I'll respond to any text that you send me. But please subscribe on any of your favorite podcast app and YouTube. We're going to see you in the next episode. It's going to be all about construction. Thank you for listening to the Drone Advantage podcast, where we're keeping business decisions at 400 feet or lower.